One of the world's youngest populations versus the world's oldest leader. Unrest continues in Cameroon after 92-year-old Paul Biya secures an 8th term as president. Just days away from inauguration, will the suppression of protests pave the way for 7 more years of Biya rule? Or could young Cameroonians force the change they crave? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Well, octogenarian leaders are not uncommon. In fact, in Africa last year, there were 8 over 80 in power. But after serving 43 years in office and just re-elected again, Cameroon's Paul Biya will be almost 100 at the end of his term. And many Cameroonians are not happy. Not only do they believe the vote was rigged, they also point to incredibly dire development statistics, including GDP per capita lower than at its peak in 1986. And a Transparency International ranking as one of the most corrupt countries on the planet. So even with protests garnering international attention, can anything bring the real change so many Cameroonians desire? Here's a look.
The re-election of a president who seemingly never loses has led to protests, violence and loss of life in Cameroon. Polls opened on October 12, and Cameroonians had the option of re-electing their current president, 92-year-old Paul Biya, or a raft of opposition challengers and other rivals. Main rival and prominent opposition figure, Issa Tchiroma Bakary, claimed the win for the opposition.
These results have deeply moved me. They show that this victory is about more than just me. It is a clear sanction against the current regime and a plebiscite in favour of immediate change, because the victory is clear.
But in the days after the election, the current president and his supporters didn't back down either, declaring an 8th election victory for incumbent President Paul Biya.
I hereby declare elected President of the Republic, having obtained the majority of the votes cast, the candidate Biya Paul.
Biya is already the oldest serving non-monarch head of state anywhere in the world, and if he serves another full 7-year term, he could be president until the age of 99. Among many Cameroonians, the mood is sour. Disappointment and disbelief turned to indignation and anger.
I am tired of Biya. Honestly, we are all tired of Biya. We are here making all this noise just because of him. He's been in power too long. We are tired of him. We are tired as a family. We are exhausted. We need to bring in change. We need change. Now Paul Biya is expired. Finished.
Several protesters have been killed in clashes with police. Multiple political critics have been arrested. The country has one of the youngest population profiles in the world, but it also has high unemployment, poverty, and governance is seen as authoritarian and heavy-handed. It's also a country racked by alleged corruption, internal tensions, and regional ethnic, linguistic, and political divisions. In spite of the authoritarian image of the government, Biya is regularly accused of presidential absenteeism. One corruption watchdog released a report in 2018 after investigating the president's non-state trips. It revealed Biya had spent 1,645 days, or nearly 4.5 years in total, in Switzerland for private and medical trips over the course of his rule. Biya's supporters may claim he has modernised Cameroon, built institutions and infrastructure, and provides a symbolic measure of constancy. But his critics see it as stagnation, believing a country with one of the youngest population cohorts deserves better than the world's oldest and most unchanging president.
So, in a number of African countries, the quest to unseat aging leaders continues. So could Cameroon provide any example to follow? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Abidjan, Ivory Coast, counterterrorism expert and director of the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, David Otto, and from Dakar, Senegal, senior Francophone Africa analyst at the Control Risks Consultancy, Beverly Ochieng. Thank you both so much for being with me. David Otto, I'll begin with you. You are Cameroonian, and begin, if you can, by laying out what you think is in the cards for Cameroon now. Will this, burgeoning young population simply be forced to tolerate at least another 7 years of Biya rule? Or do they have a level of power that can actually force change? And if so, to what end?
The simple truth is that the regime, it's more or less, what I describe as a combination of autocracy and oligarchy. And the level of democracy in Cameroon is dead in the waters, because, of course, you have an executive that appoints key members of the legislature. But of course, again, has most of the parliamentarians on its side, and then of course has the judiciary on its side.
Right. I mean, we understand how the government is just, it's been ingrained over the decades now to work in this way in the favor of basically one leader, one family, some would argue. But I was asking specifically about the chance for change. You said even yesterday, and Douala we've seen as a ghost town, actually. So really, can something move? And again, to what end?
It depends on the younger generation, as you said. Cameroon has plus 70% of its population is made up of youth, below the age of 25. They are clamoring for change. These are young people that were born and they've met just one leader. And that's, something that is not acceptable to them, not because of the time that the president has been there, but because of the level of development, which is extremely poor. The country relies a lot on the government, which doesn't provide any economic development. So the younger generation is fed up with the system of governance in the country.
So let me ask Beverly then, what your take is. I mean, how much hope do you really hold out? Because we've seen protests, and not just, in West Africa and Greater Africa, but around the world, especially with the Gen Z population. They've had enough. They want stronger, better democracies that deliver to the people. But then we see the same aging leaders holding on. So in Cameroon's case, what do you see for its future?
Well, in this case, it's the ruling camp trying to offer some concessions, perhaps, to stop the wave of discontent, because, of course, it has been powerful in Madagascar, for instance, even here in Senegal, in Kenya, in Morocco. So one of the things we might see is the ruling camp trying to offer a sort of concession, such as Biya's retirement, a controlled succession, but that would definitely remain within the ruling party, not something that includes the youth or the wider population. And it goes back to institutionalism constantly failing. In Cameroon, in Cote d'Ivoire, you've had a status quo being reasserted by elections. So the questions about democracy will still prevail. The question about whether this system is working for them and giving them opportunities, socioeconomic and even political inclusion, are going to be at stake. There will be a lot of legitimacy challenges for Biya if this protest movement is able to consolidate much wider than just the rivalry between himself and the presidential, the one who was declared as not having won, Tchiroma, who, as recently as now, there's a breaking news that he has moved to Nigeria. It might end up collapsing that momentum from the opposition, but I suppose it's about people having their own internal impetus and challenging that status quo, and for what sustained period of time, especially when there's widespread repression or just a system that is built to not enable sustainable inclusivity.
Yeah, and Beverly, what about the opposition, really? Because for as much as young Cameroonians might reject Paul Biya, are there alternatives worth fighting for, even risking their lives for, as we've seen so many protesters suffer the ultimate consequences when they go out and protest against an aging, entrenched power?
I mean, that is true because at the moment, especially before even this election, the opposition did seem quite scattered. It was fairly surprising how Tchiroma was able to sort of consolidate the influence of the opposition and challenge Biya, and then how that massive turnout for the protest, the ghost town that was observed, at least in the north and in Douala, and the sort of impact that's having in voicing the fact that there is some legitimate criticism towards the government. I suppose the issue is we do have strong dispersed movements. I think we've seen that with lots of the what we're calling Gen Z protests in Madagascar or in Kenya or in Morocco. The trouble tends to be when another power, it could be the military, it could be the ruling class, the ruling elite who have already well established themselves in institution, then co-opt that movement and assert themselves, which then goes on to deny the people who've been mobilizing an opportunity to actually be in the government. Sudan is probably one of the worst case scenarios of that. What started off as a movement against Omar al-Bashir, sustained dispersed movements being run by resistance committees, has now come down to a war between two generals. And so the voices of Sudanese people is no longer part of what is the political future of a country like that. And the worst case scenario is that for other countries. But of course, a sustained, consolidated, organized movement is probably what needs to be concerted for many of these countries.
Right. Let me ask, we now have a third guest joining us. So first, let me introduce from Ningbo, China, Associate Professor of International Studies at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, David Kiwuwa. David, thank you so much for being with us. It seems we had some problems getting your line connected.
Thank you for having me.
But glad you're with us then. So in light of everything that is happening in Cameroon, it seems so far that this aging leader will stay on board. But people are also asking this question, and not just in his case, in other cases too, when we see that he's 92 years old, people ask who is really in control. We know Paul Biya's case, he can disappear for weeks at a time, and most suspect that he is getting medical care elsewhere outside of the country, whether Switzerland or China or wherever. But again, the press isn't even allowed to report on his health condition. That has been banned. So who really is running the country? Is it a family dynasty?
Thanks again for the question. For Cameroon, it's very important to understand that long-staying leadership, like it has been in Cameroon, for quite a long time, do create an ecosystem, a political ecosystem that is geared to sustaining them in power. And for that, in particular in Cameroon, the absent landlord, as the president Biya is well known, has already created and consolidated that support framework for his government, and it has almost a government of technocrats that are able to perform in his absence. And he has relied on absolute loyalty of the the coterie around him to really execute his orders, to execute his guidelines, even in his absence. So it is not so much as a family affair, because Frank, his son, while he may be interested, he does not seem to be enthusiastic in taking over, or in fact in ruling in the shadows. But it's much more of the technocrats. I think there is one of his chiefs of staff, D, who is very, very prominent in pulling the levers behind the scenes, but also in executing the diktats of Biya himself. So it's not so much of a family affair in this case, but creating a very cohesive, loyal coterie of executors of his legislation whenever he can.
So the structure is indeed complex, David Kiwuwa, behind the scenes. So this isn't just a matter of overthrowing one aging leader, which to some might seem realistic given his age, but there's actually an entire, I'll use the word entrenched structure again, behind one person that makes it what? Incredibly difficult, if not impossible in the case of Cameroon, to overthrow it?
In fact, you're very right that the ecosystem is not only dependent on one person. Normally, when we talk about long entrenched leaders, we sometimes look at one person and we forget that behind that one person, there is a political class that is, that exists to symbiotic on the system. It's the existing system. So it is so entrenched right from the military establishment. Now, if you think about Cameroon for that matter, the president of the Senate, when you look at the Supreme Court, when you look at all the important ministries, it is a system that has been built, yes, around one man, but all the other appendages equally benefit from, in a symbiotic or what you call parasitic manner, from the continuancy of Biya's presidency. And so it is not so much as just Biya's absence collapses the system, because if it collapses, because when Biya collapses, everybody collapses. So it is in their best interest to ensure that in his absence, there is a continuity. And so that structure from the military, from the police, from the judiciary, the constitutional court, and of course, the parliament and Senate, all are there to ensure the sustenance of the status quo.
Beverly, quickly, do you agree there?
Yes, that is what happens. It's not just about Paul Biya, it's about the system within the military, the judiciary, the constitutional court, whether it's the legislature. It's building up an entire world in which it's almost impossible to be able to introduce anything new or to be able to change that status quo.
And for the opposition that is there, Beverly, are they strong enough? Again, do the people believe that it's worth going to battle for?
For a long time, the Biya system has been very good at co-opting the opposition, and it's part of those concessions that they may try to offer. So it could be reforms on constitution, electoral reforms, and that way it pacifies them. But of course, it goes back to whether this is sufficient, especially for, I think, younger people who are becoming a lot more outspoken when things do not seem to be sitting right with them, or it's not sufficient in terms of their socio-political will and their inclusion and involvement in those decision-making processes.
Yeah. David, you, meanwhile, are in Abidjan, where the constitution was actually changed to allow Alassane Ouattara a fourth term. So these leaders are just able to persist somehow. So in your opinion, do these Gen Zers, this new generation that we've seen enact change across, in examples across South Asia, do they see it, given this entrenched system, as truly worth changing, or is bad kind of the best they can do, and they might as well avoid the violence and the potential for war by going to the streets and taking on military forces even in order to enact the change that they ultimately do want?
Well, I think a lot of the younger generations, as we've seen, perhaps in the case of Ivory Coast, but also in Cameroon and also in Tanzania, is that the younger generation is increasingly understanding that, they have an advantage, of using the social media to, put a lot of pressure on these governments, to give way. But of course, again, as my colleagues have said, these governments, they have a very good understanding of how the behaviors of the population is. They have very good control of the military because they appoint the heads of the military. They have very good control of law enforcement. So they use intimidation. And if you look at, for example, in the case of Cote d'Ivoire in 2010, a lot of people in this country, are kind of traumatized, because they don't want to see what happened in 2010. They don't want that to repeat itself. So somehow they are also very careful. But it's not just about the internal influence that these governments have. If you look at the case of Cameroon, for example, Cameroon has very, strategic geopolitical ways of, pulling the Western world. Take, for example, it is one of the two only countries that refused to recognize Palestine in Africa. And because, it has a very strong ties with Israel that trains its special forces. And those forces are responsible for protecting the president. But also by having Israel on its side, it does, have the ears of the United States and the backing of some of these major international organizations. So it's a very, very well crafted manner of, actually exploring or exploiting some of the weakest links that exist both internally and externally. And the Cameroon government, as well as a lot of African governments, have done very well to keep themselves in power, because they do not just control the internal mechanisms, the system and the institutions, but they have a lot of, influence in terms of how they operate externally to keep them in power.
Indeed. David Kiwuwa, we had asked at the onset of this discussion whether it's possible that Cameroon, if these protesters succeed, they could set some kind of example for other countries to follow. From what I'm hearing, it doesn't quite sound like that will be the case. I mean, there's still a chance. But in the meantime, one African country that some people think is setting an example for leadership is Botswana. And the president of Botswana, Duma Boko, actually said that any leader who wants to stay in power more than 10 years is instantly a failure. Is that true, or is he trying to, I don't know, bring attention to himself for setting an example that he wants to set for democracy in Africa? Or is he truly right?
It's a very interesting quote, because he seems to have read Museveni's own book, where he said that, back in 1980s or 1989 or thereabout, when he came into power, and say the problem with Africa is leaders who never want to leave. And, the gentleman is going into almost 40 years, and he's running for re-election for the uptenth time in January. So it is exactly the same songbook. Now, Botswana, the president is coming from a very well-meaning place. Botswana has had a very long history of what you would call a consolidated democracy. I guess, and so he's been socialized in looking at perhaps, the system kind of agreeing to the political alternation of power. So he's going to be able to say that. But it's unfortunate, and we go back to what David in Abidjan were saying, when Qatar came in, there was a lot of enthusiasm that there's going to be a turning of a new leaf, and that we will not have violence and failure to create political alternation in Ivory Coast, among others. And the gentleman, with the kind of credentials he had, there was exceptional kind of a hope that he would be chaperoning consolidation of democracy in Ivory Coast. However, as somebody has already said, power did corrupt and has corrupted him, and has corrupted a lot of other African leaders who are unwilling to yield power. So Botswana, and the president of Botswana, is coming from a very well-meaning, idealistic place. But the reality of the matter has been that in many parts of Africa, democracy is beginning, in fact, the ideals of democracy are beginning to fail the very people who need to benefit from it. So I don't think that this is going to sway anybody in Africa, because it has long been the same song that overstaying in power is a bad thing, and the next thing they do is they change the constitution.
Yeah. Beverly, let me ask you one final question then. I mean, one thing that arguably has changed is, among young people, the means of protesting, the means of communicating. Social media, some say it's become this magical tool for people to get their voices out there, to be heard, and to fight those in power. Others say, no, it has backfired. It has made people incredibly vulnerable and put them at greater risk. What do you see this Gen Z generation being able to do, particularly in how they take their power to the streets via social media or other means? Are you optimistic about those mechanisms?
I mean, ultimately, yes. There was a feeling that Gen Z could be somewhat self-centered, mostly just absorbed in looking at themselves and following their own lives on social media. But they've also been able to use that to consolidate movements and to be able to consolidate, whether it's rhetoric, challenging government positions, or educating one another. I mean, Kenya comes a very strong example. When the finance bill was being debated in Parliament, people translated it into various local languages and shared it all over X, Facebook, TikTok, just so that people could understand what the impact this bill would have on their lives. There was one person who had been briefly detained because she had set up a sort of app where she would send messages to members of parliament to address why the public was against particular bills. But even across the board, whether it's symbolism or being able to use, for instance, the symbols being used in Moroccan protests or in Madagascar, they have done that. But then again, social media has also been used to consolidate some fairly incendiary movements. Some of them are operating even in West Africa. They have been co-opted by some external powers. They are being used to portray certain leaders in a more positive light, and sometimes doing away with information which would raise criticism against some of their actions. So there is a balance to that. There is the way that young people are using it to be more outspoken, to express solidarity, to psych each other up, to consolidate messages. But there are also ways that that information is being subverted because civic education on online technology, as well as usage of online media and self-publishing, that tends to be very limited in terms of editorial control and oversight.
Beverly, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with me, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.